Imagine carrying a secret so powerful, it could turn your entire life upside down. Now picture being locked behind bars, accused of a crime you swear you didn't commit, and your only request to the outside world is something so simple, yet heartbreakingly profound. 3 kites, 1 blue, 1 yellow, 1 purple. Sounds trivial, doesn't it? But what a young officer did with that request didn't just change the fate of a prisoner. It challenged an entire system that thrived on silence. And here's the shocking part. It all started with a gesture so small it could have easily gone unnoticed. Avery Collins felt the weight of Grey Harbor the very moment she stepped through its gates. The salt air from the nearby bay clashed with the metallic tang of rusting fences, and beneath it all lingered a silence heavy enough to press against her ribs. At 28, Avery had already learned what it meant to be punished for doing the right thing. Reporting a captain for harassment should have been the start of justice, but instead it earned her a transfer for the needs of service. Everyone knew what that meant. Grey Harbor wasn't hell, but it was close enough. Forgotten by the state, left to rot by oversight, a place where lines blurred, and no one bothered to look twice. Most officers there carried themselves with a certain resignation. Eyes down, shifts clocked, paychecks collected. But Avery held herself differently. Pinned inside her uniform, where no one could see, was a small button from years past etched with the words, "Hold the line." It wasn't just a phrase. It was the only thing keeping her spine straight when everything around her pushed her to bend. She had come here prepared to survive, nothing more. Yet life has a strange way of finding cracks in even the strongest armor. That crack appeared in the form of Marcus Ito, 35 years old, tall but slightly stooped, with black hair that never seemed fully tamed. To most inmates he was invisible, the kind of man who could stand in a crowded room and still be mistaken for part of the furniture. His record labeled him a white-collar criminal, a fraudster caught in the wires of corporate greed. But Avery noticed something odd. He never fit the rhythm of prison life. In the cafeteria line, he carried his tray with quiet precision. In the yard, while others shouted over a basketball game, he stood apart, staring at the sky as if searching for something far away. Curiosity was dangerous inside these walls. Still, Avery found herself watching him closer. She saw the notebook he carried everywhere, pages filled with numbers, arrows, symbols that looked like puzzles missing their final piece. He never boasted, never joined the endless prison banter. It was as if he existed in 2 places at once, physically behind bars, but mentally chasing something beyond them. And that distance made him a problem. In prison, a man without edges invited suspicion. One evening during her rounds, she found him in the prison chapel. The stained glass windows had long since lost their color, the pews warped by damp air. Yet Marcus sat at the front, not praying but building. On his lap rested a fragile frame of thin wooden sticks wrapped in fabric, dyed a deep shade of violet. Avery's instincts tightened. "What's that?" "Your weapon of choice?" she asked dryly, her hand brushing the baton at her hip. He looked up slowly, and his answer was so soft it almost disappeared into the stale air. "It's a kite, a kite." The word landed strangely, almost childlike, absurd against the backdrop of razor wire. Avery raised an eyebrow, her voice edged with suspicion. "Planning to fly it over the fence?" Marcus shook his head. "No, it's not for me. My daughter wanted to see 3 kites flying at Point Beacon, blue, yellow, and purple. I never kept that promise." He didn't flinch as he spoke, but there was something raw in his eyes, a vulnerability prison usually crushed out of men. For a moment Avery considered laughing it off, walking away, yet the way he held that fragile frame, as though it were the last piece of himself that hadn't been stripped away, stopped her. "And what exactly do you want me to do?" she asked, careful not to reveal more interest than protocol allowed. Marcus looked at her with a steadiness that unsettled her. "Take them to Point Beacon. Fly them at sunset, record it. Bring the sky back to me. It was insane, ridiculous even." She was a corrections officer, not a messenger boy for broken men with broken dreams. Still, something about the request lodged itself in her chest. He went on, his voice dropping even lower. Willa, that was her name. She said kites carried messages to those we couldn't reach with our voices. If someone out there takes care of the wind, I'll take care of the numbers. He left the words hanging like an unfinished equation. Avery didn't respond. She simply turned, her boots echoing against the chapel floor, and left him there. That night, though, sleep evaded her. The image of that purple kite kept floating through her thoughts, stubborn as the salt wind outside. She told herself she wouldn't get involved. She told herself it wasn't her job. But sometimes the smallest request carves the deepest scar into conscience. And Avery, for all her discipline, felt the first tug of a string she hadn't meant to hold. Sunday arrived cloaked in restless wind. Avery parked her car far from the crowded stretch of Point Beacon Beach, pulling a plain baseball cap low over her brow. She told herself it was foolish, that she should have let Marcus's words evaporate inside the chapel. Yet here she was, clutching a simple bag containing fabric, sticks, and spools of twine. Families filled the sand with laughter and barking dogs, children chased gulls, and the air smelled of salt and sunscreen. None of them knew she wasn't there for leisure. She was there to keep a promise she'd never actually made. Her hands trembled slightly as she tied the first line. The purple kite lifted clumsily, wobbling against the gusts, and for a heartbeat Avery thought it would collapse back into the surf. But then the wind caught its wings, pulling it higher, and she felt the strange tug of exhilaration. It was clumsy, awkward, and yet beautiful. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her chest loosening as the kite steadied itself against the pale sky. Next came the blue. It fought harder, tangling at first, but with persistence it climbed to join the purple. And then the yellow, the most stubborn of the three. Avery cursed under her breath, stumbling in the sand as the line yanked against her palm. But after a struggle, the last kite soared. For a fleeting moment, all three danced together above the lighthouse, ribbons of color cutting across the washed-out horizon. Her phone captured just enough seconds of flight before the strings tangled. She reeled them back in, her pulse quick and her heart heavier than she expected. Back at Grey Harbor the next morning, she moved with practiced indifference. During her rounds, she passed the recycling bin in the north wing, pausing only long enough to drop a small transparent flash drive inside. She didn't look up, didn't linger, just kept walking as if nothing mattered. Hours later, Marcus retrieved it with the ease of someone who had been waiting. His fingers closed around the plastic like a drowning man grabbing air. After that, words flowed easier. They spoke more often, though never with the casual chatter of friends. Marcus shared fragments of his life, pieces stitched together with numbers and loss. He told Avery about Willa. 8 years old, her laughter brighter than anything money could buy, gone too soon. He spoke of his work at North River Foods, how he uncovered data spikes that made no sense, nitrates and solvents leaking into community wells, the sudden surges in contamination hidden behind server adjustments. When he refused to falsify reports, the company flipped the narrative. Suddenly he wasn't a whistleblower. He was a fraudster. Avery listened with folded arms, outwardly unimpressed. She'd heard every excuse before. Yet there was something different in his eyes, a steady refusal to play the victim. "If I can prove it, it's not just about me," Marcus insisted. She didn't answer. Still, when she returned home that night, she opened her old laptop. She typed, "North River plus nitrates plus Grey Harbor." The search yielded fragments, scattered notes from local outlets. Nothing concrete. But one name surfaced repeatedly, Carmen Blake, an investigative reporter known for sinking her teeth into stories others abandoned. Carmen's work carried weight, and if anyone could dig deeper, it was her. Avery hesitated, then created a new email under an alias. She wrote of a contact inside Grey Harbor, with access to logs, timestamps, file hashes. It was risky, reckless, but her finger pressed send anyway. Carmen's reply came sharp and professional. Bring me one verifiable point. I'll do the rest. It was the kind of cold steel Avery respected. Proof came through Marcus's notebooks, meticulous entries that mapped file codes against corporate meeting schedules. She passed them along carefully, one piece at a time. And then fate introduced Leonard Pierce, a former compliance director now frail, bitter, and weary of secrets. Leonard carried the final nail. Recordings of executives dismissing contaminated water as nothing more than a cost of operation. It was no longer a story. It was a detonation waiting for the right spark. Carmen didn't publish alone. She partnered with 2 national outlets to release everything in synchronized fashion. The morning it hit, headlines spread like fire. Documents link corporate dumping to toxic spikes in coastal communities. Marcus's name appeared not as a villain, but as a man crushed by the machine he tried to stop. Inside Grey Harbor, the fallout arrived swiftly. The warden summoned Avery to his office, his voice a careful balance between warning and shield. I won't ask questions I don't want answers to. But remember this, when procedures exist for a reason, it wasn't a threat. It was survival advice. Still, Avery walked out with her pulse drumming louder than any lecture, and then came the shift no one expected. A federal prosecutor ordered Marcus's conviction reviewed. His defense team filed for immediate relief. The prison buzzed with rumors, officers whispering in the break room, inmates casting suspicious glances. But beneath the noise one truth lingered. The line had moved. The silence was breaking. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale coffee. Marcus Ito, dressed in a suit borrowed from the public defender's office, sat rigid at the defense table. For the first time in years, there were no bars between him and the world, only the cold gaze of the system that had buried him. Outside, cameras swarmed, journalists shouted questions, and protesters carried signs demanding justice for poisoned communities. Inside, silence clung to every wall, broken only by the shuffle of papers and the low hum of air conditioning. The prosecution painted Marcus as a disgruntled employee, a man bitter over lost promotions, willing to bend data for revenge. But the evidence Carmen Blake had gathered told a different story. Timestamps, server hashes, recordings from Leonard Pierce, all pieces of a puzzle showing deliberate manipulation. When the jury leaned forward, it wasn't for the prosecution's theatrics. It was for the numbers Marcus laid out with calm precision. He wasn't fiery, he wasn't grand. He simply explained step by step how spikes of nitrates always followed maintenance windows, how reports were scrubbed before reaching regulators, how communities suffered while executives cashed bonuses. Still, the pressure was suffocating. During breaks, Marcus sat with his head lowered, his hands gripping the table until his knuckles paled. Avery watched from the gallery, her badge left behind, her button pressed between her fingers like a secret prayer. She could see the fear creeping in, the same fear prison had carved into him. Yet when his eyes met hers across the room, there was something steadier. She wasn't nodding encouragement, she wasn't smiling, she was simply there. And that somehow was enough. The defense tried their final trick, dragging Marcus's daughter into the narrative. They mentioned Willa's death, implying grief had clouded his judgment, that his obsession with kites and numbers was the madness of a broken man. The courtroom froze, breaths caught. For a moment Marcus faltered, his lips pressing into a thin line. Then he spoke. If I wanted revenge, I would charge for it. Instead, I started a foundation in her name to serve families crushed by systems like this. I don't seek vengeance. I seek repair. His words hung heavier than any cross-examination. It didn't take long. The jury returned in less than a day, their decision unanimous. Guilty, not Marcus, but the corporation. Executives faced charges of conspiracy and environmental negligence. The judge imposed fines reaching into the hundreds of millions, along with a federal reparations fund for affected communities. When the gavel struck, Marcus didn't smile, didn't raise his hands in triumph. He simply exhaled, as if finally laying down a weight too heavy for one man to bear. But victories in court rarely translate into peace. Outside, journalists swarmed him, shouting questions about fraud, about freedom, about whether he regretted anything. Avery guided him through the crowd, her hand firm on his arm. "Don't say a word," she murmured, and for once he obeyed without argument. They ducked into a side street where the noise faded, replaced by the hum of the city. For a moment both stood still, breathing. A week later, Marcus walked out of Grey Harbor officially free. No fanfare, no banners, just a worn leather folder under his arm and a small spool of kite string in his pocket. Avery waited near the gate, plain clothes, no badge. He looked different, not younger but lighter, as though he'd set something down even the air couldn't carry. "Coffee?" he asked, his voice scratchy but steady. She nodded, and together they walked toward the world that had once turned its back on him. Over bitter mugs in a quiet Seattle cafe, Marcus spoke of beginnings rather than endings. He didn't want his name cleared only for his own sake. He wanted something larger, a foundation named after Willa, to help families of children in treatment who were abandoned by the legal and corporate machinery. When a parent is buried under trials, paperwork, prison bars, it's the child who pays, he said, his hand tightening around the mug. Avery listened, silent but moved. She thought of the years she had spent holding her own line alone, and for the first time she considered what it might mean to hold it alongside someone else. Within weeks, she handed in her resignation. She sold her television, downsized her apartment, and rented a tiny office space in Belltown. Flyers printed on cheap paper bore a name and a QR code, the Willa Foundation. The dream was fragile, like the kites Marcus once imagined flying. But even fragile things could rise if given enough wind. And then came the first test. A woman named Donna Reeves walked into their office, carrying exhaustion like a second skin. A single mother with 2 jobs, she couldn't keep up with her son Caleb's hospital appointments. The boy was 7, thin as a reed, his smile faint but stubborn. His father was trapped in a drawn-out hearing over parole violations, leaving the family scattered and powerless. The foundation mobilized. Volunteers arranged rides. Lawyers pushed the court for urgency. Hospital staff coordinated visits. Caleb's drawings brightened the office walls, one of them a yellow kite soaring above the Point Beacon lighthouse. For Avery, the sight of that drawing was both wound and salve. She stood staring at it long after everyone else left, the knot in her throat making it impossible to speak. She didn't need to. The message was clear. This wasn't just Marcus's redemption. It was hers too. The office of the Willa Foundation buzzed with a kind of quiet chaos that Avery had never known before. Phone calls overlapped, volunteers scribbled notes on sticky pads, and the small waiting area filled with the hum of anxious parents and tired children. It was nothing like the sterile rigidity of prison halls, yet somehow the pressure felt heavier. These were not inmates counting down days. These were families dangling on threads, each story more fragile than the last. And Avery, who had spent years gripping rules like a lifeline, now had to learn how to bend them for survival. Donna Reeves's case had barely settled when the next storm hit. A grandfather called, frantic about visiting rights. His daughter was incarcerated 2 counties away, and he was raising her 2 grandkids on his own. The children hadn't seen their mother in months. The bus routes were impossible, and his car had broken down for good. "They need to see her," he pleaded, "before they forget her face." Avery's jaw tightened. She remembered nights in Grey Harbor, when faces blurred into shadows, when silence threatened to erase people from existence. She promised the old man she would find a way, even though she had no idea how. Marcus was learning too. He handled donors, paperwork, and endless interviews. The press wanted a fallen hero story, something neat for headlines. But Marcus refused to perform indignation. He kept repeating the same phrase, "We serve, not sell." It frustrated some reporters and baffled others, but it became the quiet motto of the foundation. Whenever the weight of bureaucracy threatened to drown them, Avery would repeat it under her breath like a shield. "We serve, not sell." Then came the call they couldn't ignore. Federal prosecutors wanted Marcus to testify, not just about North River's data logs, but about the culture of cover-ups that stretched beyond his case. The request hit him like a cold blade. Testifying again meant reliving every humiliation, every dark corridor of courtrooms and prison cells. His hands shook as he read the subpoena, his lips pressed thin. "I can't go back there," he whispered, as if the walls themselves might close around him again. Avery didn't try to dismiss his fear. She knew the cost of silence and the price of truth. Instead, she spoke plainly. "You're not standing alone this time. You've got the data, the witnesses, the foundation. You're not one man against a machine anymore. You're part of a line we all hold together." Her voice was steady, but her hand lingered briefly on the button in her pocket, feeling the etching hold the line. The trial began weeks later, drawing national attention. News vans lined courthouse steps, pundits debated nightly, and communities poisoned by contaminated wells filled the gallery. Marcus walked in pale, his shoulders tight, but his eyes clearer than they had been years ago. He didn't speak like a victim or a martyr. He spoke like an analyst, precise, calm, unwavering. He laid out graphs, logs, and charts, showing how contamination spikes matched board meetings, how emails celebrated profit even as emergency rooms filled with sick children. The courtroom was spellbound. The corporation's attorneys fought viciously, labeling him resentful, unstable, obsessed. They sneered at his notebooks, mocked his kites, even tried to paint Avery as an accomplice blinded by sympathy. But Marcus never wavered. When asked why he kept fighting, his answer was simple: because silence is the most expensive lie of all. The words cut sharper than any cross-examination. For weeks, the trial dragged on. Every night, Avery collapsed onto her couch, the exhaustion bone-deep, yet her mind replayed each testimony, each headline. The world outside was finally seeing what Marcus had carried alone for so long. But the question that haunted her wasn't whether the jury would convict the corporation. It was whether Marcus could survive being broken open again in front of everyone. Then one morning, something shifted. Letters began arriving at the Foundation's tiny office, from families across the country, from whistleblowers in other industries, from children drawing kites and sending them taped to paper. One note, scrawled in shaky handwriting, read, "Thank you for giving us air again." Avery pinned it to the wall above her desk. When Marcus walked in that evening, worn and heavy, she pointed to it. He read it silently, then nodded. His shoulders straightened, if only by an inch. The trial wasn't over. The battle was far from won. But in that moment, with letters spilling across their office and children's drawings taped to the windows, Avery realized something profound. They weren't just holding the line anymore. They were becoming the wind behind it. The jury deliberated for hours that felt like years. Outside the courthouse, the sky hung heavy, clouds pressing low as if the world itself held its breath. Inside, every cough, every shuffle, every creak of a wooden bench seemed amplified. Avery sat rigid in the gallery, her fingers digging into her palm where the button lay hidden, its words a silent mantra. Marcus sat at the defense table, his expression unreadable, though his right leg betrayed him with its constant trembling. When the jury finally filed back into the courtroom, the air cracked with tension. The foreman stood, paper trembling in his grip, and began to read. Guilty. On charges of conspiracy, guilty. On charges of environmental negligence, guilty. On deliberate falsification of safety reports, guilty. The list went on, each word falling like a stone into water, sending ripples through the chamber. Marcus didn't move. He simply closed his eyes, letting the sound of justice, raw, imperfect, but real, wash over him. The judge's ruling thundered next. He imposed staggering fines on North River, demanded a reparations fund for affected families, and ordered independent oversight of corporate environmental practices. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled furiously, and the gallery erupted in whispers that surged like a storm tide. Yet through all the noise, Marcus remained still, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his face calm in a way Avery had never seen before. But victories are never clean. After the verdict, reporters swarmed him again, hungry for quotes, desperate for sound bites. They asked about revenge, about prison, about his daughter. Marcus said little, only repeating one sentence. "This was never about me. It was about them." He gestured toward the families in the gallery, mothers clutching children, fathers with tears streaking their cheeks. The cameras caught it, but the simplicity of his words didn't sell as well as outrage would have. Avery knew the media would twist it. Still, the truth had been spoken. In the days that followed, the Willer Foundation grew faster than either of them had prepared for. Calls poured in, donations trickled, and volunteers multiplied. Their office walls filled with drawings, letters, and photographs, a collage of gratitude and need. Marcus spent long nights hunched over spreadsheets, mapping logistics with the same precision he once used for data analysis. Avery worked the phones until her voice cracked, learning to balance empathy with efficiency. They were building something real, something alive, yet shadows lingered. North River was not a corpse. It was a wounded animal, and wounded animals bite. Rumors spread of appeals, of political pressure, of attempts to discredit the foundation as a front for activism. Anonymous messages slipped into their inbox, warnings written in clipped sentences. "Careful where you fly those kites." Avery deleted them, but the unease stayed, crawling at the edges of her mind. One evening, as the city settled under a dusky sky, Marcus placed a stack of envelopes on Avery's desk. They were filled with letters from families they had already helped. Small victories, glimpses of lives steadied by their work. "This," he said, his voice low but steady, "is what they can't erase." Avery looked at the pile, then at him. His face was worn, lined with exhaustion, yet illuminated by something she hadn't seen before. Peace. That weekend they returned to Point Beacon. There was no crowd, no spectacle, only the crash of waves and the sweep of the lighthouse beam across the darkening sky. Together they launched 3 new kites, purple, blue, and yellow. The lines tangled in their hands, tugging, resisting, but eventually found the wind. The colors soared, carving streaks across the heavens. Avery felt the pull on her palms, strong and steady, and for the first time in a long while she let herself smile. Standing beside her, Marcus whispered Willa's name into the salt air. It wasn't a prayer. It was a promise, a vow that what began with 3 fragile kites would not end with them. As the sky swallowed their colors, Avery understood. They weren't just keeping a promise anymore. They were building a future, and somewhere in the distance, where sea met sky, it felt as though the wind itself had chosen to carry them forward. Seattle never really slept, but in the cramped office of the Willer Foundation, night stretched into something heavier than exhaustion. The phone rang until the answering machine broke. Emails flooded in faster than Avery's eyes could skim them. Parents begging for transport to medical appointments. Grandparents pleading for help with custody hearings. A nurse offering extra shifts to volunteer. A lawyer suggesting pro bono hours. The weight of so many voices stacked on top of each other was staggering, but Avery refused to let any of them disappear into silence. Marcus kept his own kind of vigil. Surrounded by spreadsheets and half-drunk cups of coffee, he mapped routes for volunteers, calculated costs, and tracked every dollar of donations. He wasn't chasing profit anymore. He was chasing breath for families on the brink. But the old fear still lingered. He double-checked every figure, triple-checked every schedule, haunted by the memory of doctored numbers and fabricated reports. Avery noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way he rubbed his temples when he thought no one was watching, yet she didn't correct him. She knew his obsession wasn't paranoia anymore. It was protection. Their walls told the story better than either of them could. Children's drawings layered across bulletin boards, letters scribbled in shaky handwriting, photos taped at odd angles, kids smiling despite IV drips, parents clutching paperwork with hope rekindled. At the center of it all hung a single photograph of Willa, her small hands gripping a kite spool larger than her chest. It wasn't just memory, it was mission. And anyone who entered that office felt the gravity of her presence. But the battle was far from over. North River, though crushed in court, wasn't finished. Newscasts aired whispers of appeals. Politicians muttered about economic impacts and overreach. And in the shadows, messages kept arriving at the foundation. Unsigned warnings, veiled threats. "Stay in your lane. You can't fix what's broken." Avery shredded them, but the unease grew roots. Each time she locked the office door at night, her hand lingered a second longer on the handle just in case. Then, one afternoon, the past came crashing back. Leonard Pierce, frail and pale from illness, requested a meeting. He arrived coughing into a handkerchief, his eyes sunken but burning with urgency. "They're not stopping," he rasped. "There are more records, more lies. I can't carry them anymore." He slid a flash drive across the desk toward Marcus. Inside were recordings and documents that reached deeper than either of them imagined. Evidence of systemic deception spanning years, touching not only water safety but food supplies, export records and regulatory bribery. For Marcus, the flash drive was both salvation and curse. Proof meant accountability, but it also meant reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. Avery saw the conflict in his eyes, the tremor in his hand as he held the small device. "If we expose this," he said quietly, "we start all over again, courtrooms, headlines, threats." His voice cracked. "And what if this time it breaks me?" Avery reached across the desk, her hand steady on his. "Then we don't carry it alone." "Not anymore." The room fell silent, the hum of city life muffled beyond the window. For a long moment Marcus didn't answer. Then slowly he nodded. It wasn't a promise of strength. It was simply permission to try again. That night Avery couldn't sleep. She stood at her window, the Seattle skyline glittering like a restless ocean of light. She thought about the button tucked in her pocket, the words etched into her bones. Hold the line. Until now she had believed it meant standing still against pressure, never bending. But maybe, she realized, holding the line wasn't about resisting. Maybe it was about pulling together, keeping others from falling when the wind turned cruel. The foundation had begun as a gesture, born in a chapel where hope seemed impossible. But now it had become something larger, a movement tied to every kite that cut the sky, every voice that refused silence. And Avery knew with certainty the hardest part wasn't what they had already faced. It was what waited just beyond the horizon. The weeks that followed felt like walking on a tightrope strung between victory and collapse. The Willa Foundation's name spread through newspapers, community boards, and late-night talk shows. Donations grew, volunteers multiplied, and families lined up with stories heavy enough to break anyone's spine. Yet with each new case, Avery felt the line they held stretching thinner, tighter, ready to snap. Marcus bore the weight in silence. He was no longer an inmate defined by a case file, but freedom didn't erase scars. Sometimes in meetings his gaze drifted toward invisible walls. His shoulders flinched at loud voices. His breath hitched in crowded rooms. Avery saw it, though he never spoke of it. She understood. Trauma rarely asks permission before returning. Still, he pressed on night after night, fueled not by revenge but by the memory of a girl who once believed kites could send messages to the unreachable. One morning, the office buzzed louder than usual. The federal prosecutor had called. They wanted Marcus not just as a witness, but as a partner in shaping oversight reforms for corporations with histories of environmental violations. It was unprecedented. A former convict helping to design safeguards against the very abuses that had destroyed him. Marcus stared at the phone in disbelief, his voice a whisper. They actually want me at the table." Avery didn't hesitate. "Then sit down like you've belonged there all along." But hope, as always, came hand in hand with backlash. North River's legal machine filed appeal after appeal, stalling payments to victims, painting Marcus as unstable. Media pundits tore into his past, speculating about his mental health, mocking the foundation as a vanity project built on guilt. Anonymous threats intensified, voicemails filled with static and venom, shadows lingering near the office at odd hours. For every letter of thanks pinned to their wall, there was a reminder of the forces waiting to see them fail. In the midst of this storm, Avery discovered something surprising. The foundation was no longer just a project for Marcus. It had become her anchor. After years of holding herself apart, of hiding behind uniforms and protocol, she found purpose in the mess, in the late-night calls, in the quiet tears of strangers who finally felt seen. She had thought she came to help Marcus, but somewhere along the way, the work began stitching her own fractures closed. One evening, exhausted from another day of chasing funds and fending off attacks, they returned to Point Beacon. The sky was sharp and clear, the wind impatient. They carried with them 3 new kites, bright and unscarred. As they lifted into the sky, colors threading against the horizon, Avery felt the strain in her hands, the tug of resistance, the fear of snapping. But the lines held. Together they steadied each other, letting the kites climb higher. "Do you ever wonder," Marcus asked, eyes fixed on the sky, "if this is what she meant all along? That it was never just about the kites, but about the people holding the strings?" His voice cracked, but Avery didn't answer. She simply tightened her grip, letting the silence speak. Behind them, the lighthouse cast its steady beam over water darkening with nightfall. Ahead of them, 3 colors swayed stubbornly against the wind. And in that fragile balance, between earth and sky, between breaking and holding, Avery felt something unshakable settle inside her. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were leading. The last case of the season came like a storm rolling in from nowhere. A mother of 2, her husband incarcerated on a technical parole violation, found herself choosing between paying rent or paying for her daughter's chemotherapy transport. By the time her call reached the Willer Foundation, her voice was cracked from crying, nearly gone. Avery and Marcus didn't hesitate. They moved resources, called in favors, and rerouted volunteers. But this one tested them like no other. Nights blurred into days, and still the needs outpaced their reach. When the girl, small and bald from treatment, stepped into their office clutching a crayon drawing of a purple kite, Avery felt her throat close. She knelt to eye level, the child's quiet resilience crashing harder than any courtroom verdict ever could. Marcus stood nearby, silent, his hand tightening on the edge of the desk. Later, he whispered, "This is Willa's legacy. Not me, not us, her." Avery didn't argue. She only placed her hand on his shoulder, steady as the wind at Point Beacon. The threats from North River continued, but something had shifted. Communities once silent now raised their voices. Reporters hounded the company with relentless questions. Families carried kites to rallies, bright colors tugging at the sky like stubborn declarations. The chorus of doubt and mockery that once followed Marcus was drowned out by something louder, something stronger: solidarity. For the first time in years, he no longer looked like a man waiting for punishment. He looked like a man building. Avery, too, felt the change. She no longer measured her worth in how tightly she clung to rules. Now it was in how firmly she held the line for others. Not a wall, but a lifeline. Each call answered, each family steadied, each child smiling through hardship. These were the markers of her service. The button in her pocket was no longer just a reminder of endurance. It was a compass pointing toward the work still ahead. On a clear afternoon, they returned once more to Point Beacon, not alone this time. Families they had helped stood scattered along the sand, each carrying their own kites. Dozens of colors lifted into the sky, tugging at strings held by hands young and old. The lighthouse cut its beam across the horizon, but the true light was above, a storm of color fighting against the wind, refusing to fall. Marcus raised Willa's favorite, the yellow kite, and for a moment it faltered near the ground. He almost lost it. Then Avery stepped beside him, gripping the string with her own hand. Together they steadied it, and slowly it climbed, joining the others. Tears blurred Marcus's vision, but he didn't wipe them away. He let them fall unhidden. As the sky filled with streaks of color, Avery felt the world pause. The line in her hand hummed with tension, alive with meaning. She understood now that some lines don't confine. They connect, they carry, they lift. And so, with kites rising stubbornly against the horizon, the message was clear. The last wish of a broken man had become the first breath of countless others. In the hands of those who chose not to let go, 3 fragile strings had transformed into a movement strong enough to bend the wind itself.